Where to start? Well, can I add my thanks to colleagues who've joined us on this, because it really is extremely timely from our perspective, as Tony and I work on this paper for publication in a couple of months' time. And in leading up to it, we've been provoked to do it really by a series of conversations that we've been having, not just with ourselves, but with leaders around the world in various kinds of convenings in our own jurisdictions, and also listening not just to education leaders, but to leaders of big corporates and political leaders, because never, I think, in my lifetime anyway, has there been such a focus on the importance of leadership in times when, in some circumstances, it means the difference between life and death, and between an organisation managing to keep its head above water or sinking without trace. And leaders are certainly feeling the pressure. So if you delve into any of the literatures, you know, the McKinseys of this world, they're all quite absorbed now with the new leadership challenge. And we certainly think that it's the case in spades in education, that there is even more a sense of leadership challenge. And we wanted to try to pull that together in a way that started to make some sense of it. Tony said something about the nature of the times. I don't need to emphasize that with this audience. VUCA or what? I mean, call it the age of disruption, call it hyper change, call it a time of a series of inflections in human history. The disruptions are going to come thick and fast, whether it's floods in Steve's hometown, whether it's zoogenic pandemics. We know this is the kind of future of humanity, and we brought it upon ourselves, in a sense, partly because of our dysfunctional relationship with the planet on which we live. So we've got a huge amount to face, and we think there are some signs in the air of how leaders need to reorient their focus and their thinking in education. May I say, for a start, this is not to kind of disrespect or disregard any of the thinking that's gone on around education up until now. All of that has huge validity, and I'm thinking particularly here of notions of inclusive leadership, co-creative leadership, distributive leadership. I know I'm using a lot of adjectives here, but particularly personal qualities around empathy, hugely around empathy. And I think that's one of the things that's really come through in the business literature, that the leaders who are listening and who understand how their co-workers and their customers, their stakeholders in general are feeling about things is really important. And indeed, the personal quality of humility, this is one of Steve's themes in his work around imperfect leaders, knowing that you don't know everything and having a humility to make that clear. So all of that stands. We're not trying to disrupt any of that, but we think there are 5 new pieces, and I've called them signposts, just because it seems to me that they signpost the direction of travel, particularly for people who, like Leslie, are charged with building the capacity either of incoming leaders or serving leaders. We know, I mean, Steve has charted this in his own work, the crisis of recruitment to leadership in education. As the age profile shifts, how difficult it is in some jurisdictions to recruit great leaders. We really need to take these things into account. So how do we inspire leaders to feel their load is lighter and they are prepared to put their shoulder to what is a pretty difficult wheel, but that it's worth the candle and they're doing the right things at the right time, ready for the times. So we think there are 5 signposts, and I'll try to, as crisply as I can, sum up what we think those are. The first is that leaders need to be in the business of not just giving a new narrative about what education is for, but being part of the creators of that narrative. We all know that storytelling is a hugely important part of leadership, but it seems to us to have a new urgency in that what we need, we believe, is a different kind of conversation, a different kind of discourse about what education is for and its fundamental purposes. And leaders at every level, taking your point, Leslie, whether they're at classroom level, whether they're institutional level, whether they're at system level, whether they're at political level, need, we believe, to be adopting a different kind of taxonomy, a different kind of vocabulary about what leadership is for. And I could say a lot more about that, but that's point 1. And it's not in the usual kind of repertoire of what leaders are asked to think about. Point 1. Point 2, we think that leaders ought to be in the business not just of being highly collaborative. That's not news. We've been talking about that and networks for many a year, but also to be leading ecosystems. What's the difference? The difference is that ecosystems are about very diverse partners. So this is about breaking out really the kind of silo of education and making it clear that as a leader in education, you understand that, that education is about everybody's business, whether that's families, the earliest educators, whether it's localities and communities, businesses, the cultural sector, the creative sector. But we are really interested in how leaders around the world are starting now to reach out and become part of ecosystems for learning in which they are not necessarily the dominant partner, which makes it a tricky leadership challenge. The third signpost that we want to draw attention to is leading for equity. And we're prepared to be pretty confrontational about this, because the truth is that too many education systems have been complicit or have been allied to and in alliance with systems which are profoundly unequal, whether that's in class terms, whether that's in terms of their race and how kids from different races and indigenous communities particularly have been treated by the education system. We think now that leaders in this part of the 21st century, in the aftermath, no, not in the aftermath, in the midst of Black Lives Matter and many other movements for racial justice, and indeed for class justice and for better distribution of income, which is becoming increasingly unequal, leaders in education need to align themselves quite explicitly and intentionally with that in terms of their choice of curriculum, in terms of the way in which they organise their schools, and the way in which, again, they build their narrative for change. The fourth signpost for us is around what we're calling leading for agility and experimentation. And you could call that the whole space, really, of being highly judicious about the use of innovation. Not innovation for its own sake, but if COVID has taught us anything, leaders have needed to be adept and smart and swift in adopting different kinds of modalities, different kinds of organizational forms, enabling their staff to adopt different pedagogies very quickly. Somebody said to me the other day, this is like 5 years innovation compressed into 3 months by necessity. Well, it mustn't be by necessity, it should be by choice now. But that is a different set of skills for leadership to adopt, which is an understanding about innovation methods, when they're appropriate and when they're not, an understanding about how innovation is assessed and evaluated. So I think it's a fairly self-evident one, but I'll leave it there. And the fifth, which is maybe the most contentious, is that we want to argue that actually in the future, leadership needs to be futures literate. In other words, it needs to be capable, leaders need to be capable of adopting and utilizing some of the techniques of futures thinking. Now, futures thinking has got a bad rap. It's not got a very good reputation. That is the case if you identify futures thinking solely with prediction. We're not talking about prediction here. Prediction would be nice, but not often very successful. We're talking about futures thinking and futures literacy in the sense of enabling communities to think through possible and preferred futures, utilize scenarios, utilize a range of techniques in order to help people, to empower them to create the future that they want. And that's a very, very different game. I think this is a fairly new set of competencies. I think they are competencies. And some of you may want to argue, really, is that a good use of leaders' time? We think it is, and at least it's worth the debate and the discussion. Hence, I'll maybe finish with 3 points, if I may. The first is that the conversation throughout, which has brought learners, students back into the frame, is really terribly important. And so I think all of this needs to be situated in a general understanding, God knows we share it as authors here, that learner leadership is a hugely important and undeveloped, I want to come back to the undeveloped bit, dimension of all of this. Yes, Radha, we can all exercise leadership at some points, but I suppose the point I want to make here is that there are cadres of people who are given the mantle of leadership, who are elected to it or appointed to it, with whom the buck stops, and who have to take decisions about what happens and what direction things will go in after hugely, one hopes, sophisticated listening and participative processes, but in the end, they have to take decisions and are responsible for leading others, and particularly the people on this call. I mean, I suppose in our minds we had an audience of those whose responsibility it is to give those folk who take up the mantle of leadership in a role sense, because we're not moving towards open democracies in schools. I mean, we're not yet. Don't know if we will in my lifetime. People are given those responsibilities, and we're saying, actually, you know, we need to be inviting them, not just, as Steve says, to take on other people's perspectives, but really to adopt, to acquire competencies of a completely different order. So I'm not apologetic about that. I take seriously the business as learners, as leaders, but we want to situate this conversation in a broader one. The second thing I want to say is that I have to miserably say that this conversation is a very restricted one. The idea that our political leaders are talking in these terms, more or less anywhere, actually. I mean, New Zealand is a very outlying case, and, you know, I cite in the paper the leadership that Jacinda has given, and a couple of other leaders throughout the crisis, actually. But across the world, where they bother to talk about education at all, national leaders are not talking in these terms. Just witness the dominant conversations about assessment. I mean, it's threadbare in comparison to what you're talking about. So we have to recognize we've got to try and break out the bubble and find a way through to a broad conversation. And that brings me to my third point, which is about the narrative. And I just don't think that it is yet understood how radical a shift this will be when we start to talk about thriving and flourishing as against old concepts of success, the acquisition of credentials, the acquisition of qualifications, the access to the best universities and the top paying jobs. We are talking about something completely different when we speak the kind of language that Learningplanet is trying to establish around what it is to thrive. And may I say, there may even be some differences between us. Because Leslie, you said something really interesting about people. And Michael and I have this debate a lot, which is that I'm trying to argue for a less anthropocentric view, which is to say, yeah, we're pretty important on this planet, but we are a living creature amongst others who also have rights, which we have trampled on and ignored. And the planet itself, you know, its lakes and its rivers and its mountains, very much the way Maori see it, actually, needs to be put there at the center. It's not all about us and where we're going. Of course, we care quite a lot about that, actually, but you need to see it in a very integrated way. So it is a very radically different narrative, and that's not easy to get across. But I think we absolutely have to, or else we just slide back into something which is, well, second class, second rate, really.